I'd like to welcome everybody to today's event, the keynote speech, keynote lecture, and culmination of Ancient Studies Week. Today we're very lucky to have Josh Ober with us, who holds the Mitsotakis Chair in Classics and Political Science at Stanford University, and is the author of numerous books on Athenian democracy and on classical Greece. He's now working on a project about democracy before liberalism, and we're going to get a foretaste of that in his talk today about Demopolis, legitimacy, education, civic education, and civic involvement. We're very happy to have Josh with us today. Before he comes on, I just want to take a minute to tell you that the sponsors for today's talk are the Ancient Studies Department, the Drescher Center for the Humanities, the Philosophy Department, and the Political Science Department. And those of you who are here might be interested in the next talk in this series. It's given by Michael Eric Dyson, professor of sociology at Georgetown University and a fairly well-known radio host on the Black presidency, which Professor Dyson is going to be exploring the role of race in shaping Barack Obama's identity in groundbreaking presidency. So that's going to be Thursday, October 27th, on the 7th floor of the library. We're now in the gallery. So without further ado, I introduce to you Josh Ober.
Thank you, David. And I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here at University of Maryland in Baltimore, to have a chance to talk to you about a project I've been working on for about the last year and a half intensively, and for a good many years, trying to do the preliminary studies for it. And I just want to particularly thank David Rosenblum, who has been my friend and colleague for many years. He was the very first graduate student I had the privilege of working with, not as his director, but as a collaborator in Princeton many years ago, and it's been a wonderful, well, a lot of years now. All right. Let's see. This is not wanting to do quite right at the Okay, great. Great. So the general project is called Democracy Before Liberalism, and is this about the right level of talk? If I don't need to talk louder. Democracy Before Liberalism. The idea is that contemporary liberalism, and by liberalism now, I don't mean the way liberalism is being used in the rather degraded public rhetoric of an election year, right? So this is not liberals versus conservatives. This is the tradition of liberalism that is as a political commitment to the autonomy of the individual, to inherent and inalienable human rights, to state neutrality and respect to religion, and to some kind of distributive justice. So this is a philosophical tradition that is really built into the groundwork of many contemporary societies. Basic democracy, I want to claim, is something different, and that is collective and limited self-government by citizens. So the core idea behind this project is that basic democracy is not the same as liberal democracy. Basic democracy, democracy before liberalism, is not committed to autonomy, to rights, to neutrality, to justice. On the other hand, I want to argue that basic democracy is not majoritarian tyranny. So that's often the way it's thought of. If you strip liberalism from democracy, what you get is tyranny of the majority. It's not that. And it's potentially a foundation for a liberal democracy. But what it does, I think, for us is it draws our attention to a value we can miss, and that's the value of civic education. I'll say more about that at the end of this lecture. So basic democracy before liberalism, in terms of a definition, is reasonably stable collective self-government by an extensive and socially diverse body of citizens. Now, to be stable over time, a democracy requires rules, and it also requires background norms, and it requires habitual behaviors. People have to act in a pretty predictable way based on their obedience to the rules and their internalization of the norms. Okay, so that's what it is. What's it good for? Well, it's good for citizens, and it allows them to live relatively well, relatively securely, without a master. If you think that's a good thing, then this is good for you. It sustains desirable conditions, or at least conditions that I think are desirable, of social existence, political liberty, political equality, and civic dignity. Now, what are the payoffs for us, or at least for us today, where I can only give you part of this book project? Well, the payoff is that a theory of basic democracy, because this is going to be a theoretical undertaking, answers questions about democratic legitimacy in education. So it helps us answer the question, what would it be required to have or to sustain a legitimate government that is really by the people? Democracy is about collective self-government. That's government by the people. Well, what does it take to have that? And what is civic education, and why should it be necessary if you're interested in government by the people? So we start with a fundamental political question. So that's all background, right? That's what we're aiming at. How can a human community reliably get the benefits of cooperation among its members without being ruled by a master, without a tyrant, without somebody at the top telling everybody what to do? Well, democracy is the answer to that question, but how does it work and why? So that's what we're after. Now, cooperation without a master, without autocracy, without someone at the top who's just giving rules to everybody in some sort of pyramid of authority, is quite easy if the group is small enough. If you have a few dozen people, maybe under 200 people even. This is the way, by the way, that all humans lived until about 11,000 years ago. We all lived in very small groups, foraging groups, hunting-gathering societies, and anthropologists tell us, and I believe they're right, that all contemporary, or at least recent foraging groups, and probably all ancient ones, the ones that existed before agriculture, were relatively democratic. They're not authoritarian. So the vision of, the caveman with the biggest caveman, telling all the other cavemen what to do, and all the other cavemen sort of having to listen to the big caveman because he's the guy with the biggest club, is false. It's easy to have cooperation without autocracy if the group is small enough, and this is because human groups that are small enough can monitor one another. As it turns out, humans, when they live in small groups, foraging groups, don't like to have just one person running everything. And that's probably because it's inefficient. Because one person running everything can't know enough to make the right decisions for that foraging group to survive. Right? That one person doesn't know all the stuff that you need to know, doesn't know where all the good routes are, doesn't know reliably, when do the mammoths come out of the north, doesn't know reliably that we should build this kind of shelter when we're in this kind of area because the winds come out of the south. All of the things that the group can know collectively, the men and the women of the group can distribute the knowledge, and they add to it to say, we trust different ones of us to know things about different things we need to survive together. So one person says, well, I'll just run everything for you. Those groups tend not to survive, right? They tend to, such groups tend to monitor one another. Somebody gets too big for his britches, starts telling everybody what to do. People say, don't do that, right? And he keeps on doing it, and people say, you know, you're really being bad. We don't like you anymore. And he really keeps on doing it, and people say, all right, you're out. And he says, I'm not going out. And that's when you get murders in these societies, right? These societies can be violent, but they tend to be violent only when somebody's trying to become an authoritarian, because it doesn't work for these societies. Okay, so they can watch each other, make sure that people are doing the right thing, make sure that people are obeying the rules. But cooperation without authority is much harder when scale gets big, when you can't monitor each other. And in fact, when you get really a lot of advantage to somebody at the top giving people orders, when somebody at the top can in fact organize a bunch of experts who can decide, for example, how should we organize the dams that will make the irrigation system work. So basically cooperation gets much easier at scale. It solves the problem of free riding. It solves the problem of when the society can't just monitor itself. Some people might think, hey, I get it. What I want is the advantage of all that cooperation, right? Getting my share of the grain or the security or, you know, whatever it is. But I don't really want to do any work, you know. I don't really want to harvest, and I don't really want to fight. But I think I could just sort of hide in the great mass of people and get my share of security, my share of, you know, the food or whatever it is, and people won't notice. Or I can cheat on the margin. You know, I can take a bigger share of the public goods than is really good for us all collectively, but, you know, after all, I get an advantage from it. So the autocrat can solve that by saying, I'll keep an eye on things. You don't obey the rules, I will punish. So we don't all have to monitor each other. The autocrat monitors and has special police or people to, you know, keep track of things. So autocracy turns out to work out pretty well for the kinds of societies that emerge after the development of agriculture, when there's a lot more people. And autocracy is therefore historically very common. It's the usual way that societies have been organized throughout human history until very recently. Athenian history, the history of classical Athens, and thought experiment, sorry, it's supposed to be thought, not though experiment, offers us a way to think of a democratic alternative to autocracy once societies have gotten too big to do mutual monitoring. Okay, that's sort of what we're at. So let's think about Greeks first. We'll do history first. We'll look at the history of a particular word, this word demokratia or democracy, and then we'll turn to the thought experiment. So the Greek word demokratia means demos plus kratos, that's its root, people plus power. So that's unambiguous. But in what sense of each of these terms? Both demos and kratos are complicated terms. So in the 5th century BC, the people who didn't like democracy, basically let's call them elites or aristocrats, came up with a hostile definition for this new way of doing things that emerges in Athens, had emerged 50 years before. And they said that what democracy is the unconstrained domination of many poor people over the wealthy few. So they basically say it's majoritarian tyranny. That's all democracy is. And if we had the power, we the few, the elite, the aristocrats, we would dominate them. As it turns out, they dominate us by their manyness, but that's all it is. It's just a game of domination. But this is not the original definition of the inventors of the term demokratia. The inventors of the term demokratia thought it would be a great idea to have the people rule, or the people have power. So we have to try to get at their definition, or the definition then that was used by later Greek democrats in the ancient world. So this is we're not going through all of this, I promise you. The way to think about it is that there's really two sort of, whoopsie daisy, sorry. There are two roots that are used here, and let's see, there it is. So there's a kratos root, and an arche root. So there are two sort of, as it were, families of Greek words. One of them, some use this arche, means basically office, and kratos, as we've seen, means something like power. And then we can divide by how many people have the office or the power. Is it one or few or many? And then there's a bunch of other terms, most of which we're not going to be worrying about. So just if you keep in mind these two sort of core roots, and then the one, the few, and the many. So demokratia is in this kratos group, right? And it's with many. All right, so let's think about some of the other kratos roots. Aristokratia is when excellence, aristeia, is the defining principle of the regime. And likewise, timokratia with honor, the defining principle. Isokratia is when equality is the defining principle. Now, isokratia is going to be especially important to us, to sort of make a mental note of that, because along with some of these other iso root terms, these equality root terms, it's used in antiquity as a synonym for democracy or democratia. So here's a few of these other iso root terms. So isonomia equal law, isegoria equal public speech, isomoiria equal shares of public goods. All of these iso prefixes refer to equality in the particular sense of access, in the sense of right or capacity to make use of something. So you have isonomia, you have the right or the capacity to make use of law, or isegoria, the right or capacity to make use of public speech or shares of public goods and so on. So isokratia, you had that mental bookmark, right? This is the one that is quite close to demokratia. So isokratia pertains when the general principle of the regime is equal, iso, access to the public good, kratos, of power. Right? So kratos here is not domination, it's not monopoly on offices, as the arche roots were concerned with, but positively kratos seems to refer to strength or enablement or the capacity to do things. So isokratia is when those who are equal have the capacity, they have power, they have kratos, they have power as capacity, not power as domination, right? Power as capacity to do things. So demokratia now, by extrapolation from isokratia, is, we can say, the empowered demos. But empowered in the sense that the demos, the people, have this capacity to do things. The regime in which citizens that's the demos root, is the defining principle of the regime, and the inclusive demos, that is, citizens are all residents who can be culturally imagined as potential citizens, and that in the Greek world was native adult men, right? So those are everybody who could be imaginable as a citizen, like native adult men. When all imaginable citizens, the demos, gains a collective capacity to effect change in the public realm. So that's what democracy means in the beginning. It means the people's capacity to do things. It means collective self-governance by the citizens, by the demos. It doesn't mean domination of the many over the few. It means the people's capacity to do things. But was that self-government, was that capacity in any way limited? And the answer is yes, especially after a series of legal reforms at the end of the 5th century BC. We're not worried about the details of that now. The point is there were some reforms. The motivation for that limitation was not liberalism. It wasn't suddenly people decided that they were concerned with natural rights or human rights. Rather, they were concerned with a social equilibrium. They thought their society was going to fall apart if they didn't find ways to limit the power of the people, limit their use of their capacity to do things in ways that would be rule-bound. They recognized that social equilibrium was necessary for collective security and prosperity. Our society is going to fall apart. It's going to be anarchy. We're going to be poor and at the mercy of our enemies. So, the mature Greek definition of democracy then, collective self-governance by all citizens, as in the original definition, but limited by constitutional laws, limited by rules that we make as citizens in order to sustain our security, our prosperity, and our ability to live without a master, non-tyranny, right? Because that's the core of it, is that we rule ourselves. We're not dominated by somebody at the top of the society. Okay, so that's the Greeks, right? So now we move to a thought experiment. Sorry for classicists, that's probably the really interesting part is over for the most part. But those of you who are interested in political theory and really aren't that crazy about Greek philology can wipe your brow and say, oh, the interesting part might still be to come. At any rate, why should we even bother with a thought experiment? After all, we've figured out what the original definition is. Can't we just stay there? Well, of course, the answer is that Athens has got a lot of historical baggage. Citizenship is limited to adult males. It's a slave society, so women excluded, slaves, and very limited enfranchisement. Athens is also very small compared to modern nation states, a few 100,000 people rather than a few 100 million. And so ancient Athens can use direct democracy instead of representation. They don't have to worry about the problems of representation. Well, the thought experiment allows us to ditch the baggage, right? Because it's a thought experiment. We can set it in any imagined context in any period that we like, and it allows us to scale up. So here goes. Imagine an ordinary human society that is perfectly diverse in all kinds of ways. Here's the numbers of people here goes up, and then on the horizontal axis, people over on this side have a very low tolerance for autocracy, and the people over here think autocracy is swell, and the people in the middle just don't care very much about autocracy, or they say, fine, what's it to me? So there are just a relatively few people who have zero tolerance, and there are just a very few people who think it's absolutely great. But we can then divide this society, not exactly in the middle, but on the low side, right? And so basically cut the society not even in half, but say in thirds or something. And then we can just kick all these people out of our thought experiment. Say, you guys think autocracy is great. This is an experiment about people who don't. So that's an initial point, is this is not a sort of a normative, it's not a moral argument that's for everybody everywhere. If you just think, I'm happy with having somebody run everything. I like the idea of a king. You say tyrant, I say benevolent dictator. Okay, then you belong over here, and I probably don't have a lot to say to you, because this is for people who actually don't think that's that great. But I do want to say that there's nothing wrong with this. It's not like these people are crazy. It's just they are happy with it, and we're dealing with the people who don't like the idea that somebody can tell them exactly what to do at the highest level. So these are going to be our group. This is going to be our founder group, our citizen group. And we can imagine that the group is divided, the initial group is divided for any number of reasons. Maybe there's been a revolution. Maybe it's like 1776, for example. There's been a big revolution, and some people are going to live in what's going to become the United States of America because they don't like the idea of kings, and some people are going to go live in Canada. The point is, these things actually have happened. Similar things happened in antiquity. Okay, so in our thought experiment, the founding citizens of Demopolis, that is, all those residents of some imagined bounded territory, culturally imagined as potential citizens. So now we're not limited to say this doesn't have to be native men. If this is the 21st century that this is happening, there's no reason that it would be limited to native men, because the cultural imagination of citizenship in the great majority of the world now does not exclude women. So once again, this is why I do a thought experiment. They have to set these guys, these people, I should say, male and female, if we're imagining it as in modernity, have to set rules for their new state after whatever has caused this division. So now these founders are diverse socially. Some are richer, some are poorer. They're diverse, we can say, racially, ethnically, in terms of their values. They disagree on lots of things. It's not that they're all, sort of holding hands and saying, wow, isn't it great that we're all just the same. But they do agree on three things. They agree on the three ends for which their state will exist, and that is security, prosperity, and non-tyranny. Recognize those three terms, right? That's the idea, is we're getting pretty much the same outcome as what happens historically in Greece, right? Why are we doing this? Lots of possible reasons, but we agree on three things that we're doing. We want to be secure, we want to be prosperous, we don't want a tyrant. Okay, what do we mean? So by security, it means not living in fear, right? We want to live in a state that's capable of responding to hostile rivals, to environmental changes, not threatened by civil war, persists over time. Citizens are meant to be secure against various kinds of threats. Prosperity doesn't mean everybody is just loaded and hugely wealthy. It means not living in poverty, not living to the point in which you have to spend all of your time just trying to survive. It means you have the opportunity to pursue projects in your life beyond just surviving, right? So this, that doesn't require anything like vast wealth. The state is prosperous enough to collect revenue without impoverishing its residents, so it can compete with rival states. And finally, non-tyranny. We've talked about this. This is the beginning position, not having a master for our state. Doesn't mean necessarily that you don't have a boss at work or something like this, but it means you don't have a king or a tyrant that is ultimately running things in your state. No individual and no faction of individuals can monopolize political power. No fixed hierarchy of political power within the citizen body, right? Within those who are the citizens. So what does an individual citizen founder want? Well, founders are willing to pay some costs to achieve the three ends. They say, all right, they're of some value to me. But they don't plan to devote their whole lives to this self-government thing. Each founder wants to do other things in his life besides being involved in self-government. So if the costs of self-government get so high that it means you just don't have any time to do anything but your citizen duties, you're probably going to say at some point, look, okay, I didn't want a tyrant, but I see that it's just too expensive not to have one. So the costs have to be reasonable, and the benefits of being a citizen have to be pretty obvious and pretty substantial to make up from the time and the costs you're going to have to pay as a citizen in order to run yourselves securely and prosperously without a tyrant. So we can think about the so-called utility function. This is the way economists like to talk about things. It just means sort of what somebody wants. The utility function of the median founder, the person who's in the middle of that distribution, not the guy who hated the tyrant the most and might say, I'll give up anything not to have a tyrant, but the person who's sort of in the middle of that distribution once we've excluded the people who like tyranny. So basically what they want is to survive, right? They do not want to starve to death, reasonable enough. They don't want to be in danger. They want to have state-level security, prosperity, and they want to have non-tyranny. But they also want to have a bunch of what I'm calling socially valued projects. They want to be able to pursue things that are interesting to themselves. That might be something that's individually chosen. You say, I personally, as an individual, choose my projects. Or maybe it's something your society chooses for you. A very religious person as part of a religious community, you grow up, you didn't choose that project, but you value it. And it doesn't have to do with, running the state. It has to do with the sacred. But you won't have time for that, okay? So you won't have time for something else other than running government. So some premises that these founders are making: rule-making authority has to be, it is acknowledged as power. These people are engaged in power. This is about, this is not without the necessity of coercion. Rules must be enforced, but they have to be open to amendment. They're for now, but they're also going to bind people in the future unless they're amended. They aim at legitimacy, which means at a minimum the general willingness of those bound by the rules to obey. They're not obeying just because of fear of having somebody break their heads. They're obeying for some other willing reason. And founding by rule makers is understood as collective action. We have to do it. It is a we, and the we is the citizens. And the demos, the citizens together, can revoke any delegated powers. So if we're imagining this as a really big society, it may be that, all right, we have to make some rules. We can't get hundreds of millions of us all together into a room and argue it out. We'll delegate it out. We'll say, all right, here are a few hundred people that we think are either representative or very clever or whatever it may be. We will delegate them the authority to make some rules. If we think they're doing it wrong, we pull it back. We always have to be able to revoke the power of any group who is given temporary authority to do something in our name together. So this revocation becomes really a key thing. So okay, what are the rules they're going to set up? These are just the basic rules, the very, very fundamental rules, the rules that will allow them to make other rules that will deal with things like justice, that will deal with things like how are we going to negotiate difference. So the very basic rules to allow them to have a society that goes forward. So the first is participation. Non-tyranny is, in the technical language of social science, a non-rival, non-excludable public good. It means it's something like air, that you get it because you're part of the world of people who share the air. Or it's like security, right? If you have security, you, as a member of the society, as general security, get the advantage of security because you're just a member of the society. It's a public good. So like all public goods, non-tyranny faces the problem of free riding and commons tragedy. Because if you are a completely selfish person, then your best play is to get your share of the good, like the nice clean air that everybody breathes, or the acceptably clean air that everybody breathes, but then do things to your own advantage on the side, like run a pollution factory that's really, really profitable. It does belch a lot of pollution into the air, but on the other hand, I can live far enough from the from the pollution factory, and I can breathe the air. Even the guys who live near it can, they're not dying. Well, not dying very early. So anyway, the idea is that the tendency is that for people to free ride on public goods, end up at things like commons tragedies. Now, the only way to solve commons tragedies is either having somebody who enforces the rule, a boss who says, yep, you can't do that. Or we all have to enforce the rules. And this means we all have to participate, right? We have to create an institutional structure that allows us to be like those foragers who are all basically monitoring each other. We all have to participate in the work of self-governance, because otherwise we're going to get somebody cheating on the margin. Fine, I want security, but I really don't want to do my military service. That's dangerous. It'd be better if you guys did the military service. And just one less guy. Well, come on. We're not going to be any less secure, really, are we? And then the next person is going to say, yeah, well, me too. I want them all to do it. And pretty soon, nobody does their military service, right? Because we all have the same incentive. So if we don't all do it, we're going to get a cascade of free riding. So we're all going to have to do it. And what does this mean? It means right away in our society, we're going to have a requirement for education. Because if we're going to participate, remember, we're participating in governing ourselves. We need some education. We don't want people participating in self-government who know nothing. So we have to pay for education. And we don't want people who don't have time to do it say, I just can't do it. I will die of starvation if I don't do my 12 hours of really hard labor, or I have to put every dime into some kind of a savings account because I'm really terrified of being subject to some kind of accident or disease that's going to wipe out my family. So we're going to have to actually distribute some wealth to, or some goods to all citizens in order to allow them to participate. And we do this before we make any decisions about distributive justice. This isn't because we're liberals who believe in equality, it's because we are anti-tyrants who believe that we all have to participate or the whole thing's going to fall apart. And we all have to participate reasonably well. I mean, well enough so participation is meaningful. Okay, so the second rule is legislation. We have to be able to make more rules. After we've set up these basic rules, we've got to make a bunch of other rules. There are, lots of things. Where do we build the highways? Who gets drafted? What's the marginal tax rate? And so on. So in order to be able to legislate, we need to have political freedom because we have to have relative efficiency of legislation. And efficiency means we've got to get the best ideas out there. We need to actually have a way to take advantage of the diversity in our community and make that diversity a genuine advantage because we're going to bring all these different perceptions of the world and knowledge about the world, like those foragers who knew about the roots or the mammoths or whatever. We have to be able to bring that together. And in order to bring that together, we need free speech, freedom of assembly as we deliberate about making rules. And then we're also going to have the participation rule that we've already set, plus the desire for non-tyranny means we have to have political equality in making the rules. Because imagine that we say, all right, we're all free to speak and to assemble, but one of us is really so much cleverer than the other that basically I should have how many people here? Say it's 100. So I should have 101 votes, and you all get 1 vote each because I'm just so much cleverer than the rest of you. We can discuss things and so, but in the end, it's my vote that'll determine what we say. And you're all going to say, what? No, hold it. Now you're the tyrant. And we're in this for non-tyranny. And so if we're going to participate, we're going to have voting. We actually ultimately are going to have 1 person, 1 vote. It's the only way that it's not going to be a few of us are dominating the rest of us. Equality is basically going to be the only stable way that we can have participation plus non-tyranny go forward. And finally, we're going to have what I call civic dignity, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go forward. So the third rule is entrenchment, and that is the idea that no rule that we make subsequent to making these 3 basic rules can violate the ends of security and prosperity and non-tyranny, which was what got us into this in the first place. We agreed, we're going to try to make a state like this. So if we say, all right, but maybe we'll decide to make a rule that really impoverishes our state or makes it insecure, well, that would just overthrow the citizens' reason to cooperate. It would precipitate a civil war. And therefore, this restraint establishes limits on rulemaking. We can't make rules if they're going to precipitate as it were, poverty or insecurity. So the citizens then have a responsibility for rule enforcement, and they have to resist violation of the rules. You can't allow people to be proposing rules that are going to do this or passing rules. You've got to have common knowledge of the basic rules, and these basic rules have to be pretty clear. We have to sort of have a pretty good sense of what kind of rule would violate security or violate prosperity or would introduce sort of a sneaky backdoor form of a tyranny. Okay, so those are the basic rules. Those are the 3 basic rules. Definition of basic democracy then, Demopolis, our imagined society called Demopolis, based on these rules that we've just decided we have to make, collective and limited self-governance by an extensive and diverse citizenry aimed at 3 ends, non-tyranny, security, and prosperity. And the Athenian, or the mature Athenian definition, based on our quick review of history, is basically the same thing, right? Collective self-governance by citizens, limited by constitutional rules in order to sustain non-tyranny, security, and prosperity. So that's the basic takeaway, is we end up in pretty much the same place in this Demopolis thought experiment as we do with the Greeks, but we've gotten rid of the baggage. Okay, so let's think of what we get then in Demopolis, going forward. By their participation in that initial rulemaking, the founders, the founder citizens, affirmatively assented. They didn't just consent to being ruled. It's not just consent of the governed. They assented publicly to obey the rules and pay the costs. And those who refuse to pay the costs of citizen basically renounce citizenship. And they say that's the whole idea. If you don't want to participate, participation was the first rule. If you say, hey, hold it, I didn't know that was going to be a rule, fine. You're out. You don't want to be in this society, or you don't want to be a citizen in this society. Now, on the other hand, we don't want everybody getting out and saying, whoa, it's all too expensive, because then we won't have a society that works. And so there's going to be some constraint on rulemaking. So you're not going to be making new rules that drives a whole bunch of people out, or at least there's some constraint on that. But the real question I want to talk about today is the entry of future citizens, right? So we, the original founder citizens, all agreed we had these three things that we wanted to pursue. We all agreed, that we were going to set up these three rules. We assented. Those are the rules. Yes, we're going to do the rules, some kind of a ratification procedure. But how about future citizens? Future citizens weren't present at the founding, right? They're born later, or they come to the society. They're immigrants to this society. So they haven't assented by participation in the original rulemaking to paying costs of democracy, of self-governance. And so this is where civic education really comes in. You basically, in Demopolis, in this imagined society, whoever is running it collectively, that's us, the people, need to make some, to design an argument for future citizens that will justify to them the reasons to prefer non-tyranny and security and prosperity and pay the costs of democracy. They have to give them reasons to basically think what we thought, that these are pretty good things and worth paying some costs, right? Because there's no reason to think that they have that assumption to start with. Okay, so the basic value proposition of Demopolis, this is a term that is used by McKinsey and Company for when you're recruiting people into a company and you're trying to recruit really the best people, and it's very competitive. So you make a value proposition. Why do you want to come to company X, right? So the value proposition of Demopolis is that the valuable conditions of life that are produced by participation in democracy justifies assenting to obey the rules of the democratic government and paying the costs of civic participation necessary to sustain democracy. So basically the value proposition says this life, right, in which you have less time to spend on your personal projects because you have to have participation duties, is at least as good or better than this other life in which you've got a boss, but you have some more time to spend time on your personal projects, right? If people say, no, I want to live there, then we don't have a democratic society any longer. Okay, so there are various ancient models of civic education we could talk about. Plato in the Republic said, the way citizens need to be educated is with noble lies. We can't tell them the truth. They couldn't understand it. So we'll lie in ways that the rulers will lie in ways that persuade citizens that the rules are best for them. In the Laws, a later work, Plato thought, well, maybe that noble lies thing, I don't know. How about explanations? The rules will come with these little pre-scripts. Like each rule will say, you're about to hear a rule, here's the reason for the rule. And you'll read the reasons for the rule and you think, oh, that's a good reason, that's a good rule, I'll obey that one. So the citizens are rationally persuaded that rules are in their interest. Aristotle in the Politics thought that citizens have natural reasons in line with their natural interests to obey certain rules and values that they're going to be taught. In democratic Athens, citizens basically learn the rules on the job. They internalize the rules by, in fact, doing their job as citizens participating in government. What happens in Demopolis? Well, in Demopolis, we have active participation, though the argument is that the active participation in democracy is not just a cost, but it's a benefit. So this is the idea. Sure, it's going to be a cost. You're going to have to spend some time together being working on self-government, but it's also a benefit because you get valuable conditions of existence. You get freedom, you get equality, we've talked about that, but you also get this civic dignity, which we haven't talked about much. That is, you get high standing in your community that is equal to the high standing of others, and this means you get recognition. You are mutually recognized by your fellow citizens as worthy of being a participant. And you get the immunity, you get protected from humiliation or infantilization or disrespect or non-recognition. So you can actually live a better life, arguably, because you don't have to worry about people disrespecting you, at least insofar as disrespect would violate your capacity to participate. And furthermore, the educators of Demopolis can say democracy is of value to you, to each of you, for this reason. Because humans are a particular kind of being. Socializing, cooperating with others, reasoning, and communicating are basic human capacities. And we go through this in detail, but this is what makes us different from all other creatures, is this unique capacity to socialize or participate cooperatively with other people in ways that, frankly, even our closest primate relatives cannot do, to reason, to use our cause and effect logic, and to communicate to our fellows. This is just what it is to, or what arguably non-exclusively constitutes the kind of being you are as a human. Aristotle would say a political animal, and he does not mean the kind of political animals that we see snarling at each other every night at CNN. He means someone who can cooperate, reason, and communicate. And that Aristotle would say, and I think he's right, that exercising your capacities, these capacities that you have as a human, is good for you. It now allows you to flourish fully as a human being. That if someone were to say, look, I'll make your life go great, except you will never speak on any public thing to anybody else. Never speak. Or I'll make your life go great, except you will never use your mind in a way that puts clauses together with effects. You'll never use reason. You would say, that's ridiculous. That's not having a great life. That's awful. I think you would say that. So the idea is that participating in self-government, maximizing your chance to flourish by exercising these capacities. It promotes the pro-social use of reason, of thinking about things, and communication, talking to people about things at the very highest level. You get to talk about the things that are most important, the most important rules, the most important things that we have to collectively decide. Okay, if this seems a little obscure, think about a cat. Right? I think about cats because I live with a cat. I've lived with a cat for a long time. In fact, most of my life, one way and another, I've lived with a cat. Okay, here's a cat. Now, is that a happy cat or is that a miserable cat? That's a happy cat. Now, why is that cat so happy? Because he's pouncing. And what does a cat think when it's pouncing? I think this is what I'm implying cats think. Pouncing, 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 pouncing. I think that at least my cat seems to think that. This is great. And when I won't play with him anymore with that little teaser thing, and he can't, doesn't have anything to pounce around. He just says, oh, it's awful, I want to pounce, and I do it a little, oh, great, great, great. So anyway, that's what cats like. They like to pounce on things. Okay, is this cat a happy cat, a flourishing cat? No, and it's not just because the canary is making an idiot of him, because he's saying, well, look, I'm a kind of a chunky cat. I got plenty of food. I seem to have some kind of shelter, but no pouncing. Life in a cage is not great for a cat. And it's not like great for a cat because a cat doesn't get to do the things that make a cat a cat. And pouncing is arguably one of the things that makes a cat a cat. Okay, so imagining now our human being in this very idealized Norman Rockwell vision of a citizen participating in collective self-government, socially with other people, sort of sexist because it's old and very sort of homogenized. But anyway, you can see what he's doing is, he's standing up among his fellow humans and he's about to say something, and he's thought through the thing for his town, the New England town meeting. So there he is, a flourishing human who is, basically doing the things that humans do. And is this human as a sort of who is being denied the right to communicate, is being isolated somehow from other people, perhaps is in solitary confinement? Is this person flourishing? The idea is no. Okay, so conclusions. Demopolis, that is our thought experiment of democracy before we add in human rights and other pieces of liberalism, does not provide for everything we might want, but it's also not majoritarian tyranny. It can be limited, in fact it must be limited, and could provide a foundation for rights. You can build up a liberal society, or you could build up a communitarian society, or you could build up a religious society on this foundation. Demopolis focuses our attention on the importance of civic education in a legitimate democracy. You're not going to be able to legitimate a democracy if you cannot convince future citizens that it is to their advantage. It is right for them to support the rules, and it's right for them to support it for rational reasons. Demopolis does, in fact, create and defends political freedom, political equality, civic dignity, and it shows us why civic participation is good for us as human beings. And that's it. Thank you very much. So I don't know what the norms are, whether I'm happy to help.
For us to ask you questions. So we can open up the floor now for questions if you have any.
Are we doomed as a democracy because we no longer have an educated public?
I don't think we're doomed. But I do think that we should think about it a lot more than we do.
Think about it every day.
Yeah, I think that this is, yes, well, and I think that's right. And I think I think that to the extent that you think that the argument I gave you is a valid one, it's meant to be a reason to actually work to promote something like civic education. Now, civic education, I think, would include at its basis the kind of normal things we think of as ordinary reading, writing. You can't really participate as a citizen in a modern world if you don't have basic skills. But it's really more than that. On the other hand, I think it's less than what we often think about as a civics lesson. Right? Civics lesson is often, exactly how many representatives are in the House of, how many representatives in the House of Representatives? How do you pass a bill through the House of Representatives and the Senate? All of the, can you name the representatives of your state or your two senators? We often worry that people don't have education because they fail these kinds of tests. I actually think civic education, it's nice that people know those things, but I think it's actually more important that people think about what are the bases of effective social cooperation if it is the case that you don't want to have a tyrant. So my ideal civic education would in fact include basic education, but it doesn't collapse because most citizens don't know all the details of government. We just need to know the fundamentals of what it is we're doing together.
But I didn't even mean that. I meant the first part of your thing.
Yeah.
Reading and writing.
Yeah, well, although, when you think about it, and this is one good reason to go to Athens, the Athenians did pretty well. They don't have a society that's our size, arguably it's not as complex, but they had to deal with some very complicated issues. And although I think literacy is probably more widespread in Athens than many people have thought, it's certainly not as widespread as it is even in the contemporary United States. So, you know, I worry less about civic education beyond a kind of basic education capacity. I worry more about it that people don't think about what it is that they're doing as a citizen. They don't think about the problem of citizenship as being fundamentally a problem of cooperation and ultimately of decision making with others that sustains these very basic public goods. So.
I have another question.
Okay.
Is it a quick one, Elaine?
Yeah.
Is it a follow-up?
Tyranny of the media. I mean, that's a form of tyranny.
Yeah, it is, but it doesn't have to be, right? I mean, we live, you know, once again, if you look at Athens, they don't have organized media. So how do citizens get their information? They talk to other citizens. Right. Well, how do people in in 2016 get their information? A lot of people are getting it by talking to other people, not face to face, but through social media, right? And that can be seen as a terrible problem because people are, sort of in these echo chambers and isolated from reality. But I think there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the idea that people get information from fellow citizens. We just need to, and I think this is the challenge really for the next generation, is to find ways that social media isn't isolating people from each other, creating a little same thinking groups that don't bother to learn anything that challenges their understanding of the world. There's no reason it has to be that way, right? So there's no reason that media, in any sort of organized media sense, that certainly is what I grew up with. You know, you turned on the TV and there was Walter Cronkite telling me, you know, how the world is. And I kind of like that. And in some ways, in my family, I think, it'd be kind of nice to go back to that. But it doesn't have to be that. I think that we should be able to think through, or at least we better be able to think through, because we're not going back to that, some way in which peer-to-peer mutual communication can actually break through to understanding more. So better.
I wanted to ask about political participation in democracy.
Mm-hmm.
So, it seems like a lot of the things you were praising about democracy, it's a good way of pooling knowledge, and I like this thing about exercising our capacities to communicate and to persecute. And so it definitely resonates with me personally, because I'm a very participative person. I always like to be involved, and to, you know, if there's some problem that needs solving, I like to be involved in solving it.
Right.
So I definitely have that intuition that this is an exercise of our basic human capacity that's good. But I don't know whether I need to exercise any kind of sovereign authority to do it. So I don't know that I need full political equality. I feel like I could be a pretty good king's servant, running around doing this. So there seem to be conditions, say, of basic respect and open communication and willingness to collect knowledge that could be in communities that are not democratic.
Yeah.
And quite a lot of those capacities could be exercised.
Yeah.
So what do you think the importance of that sovereign authority is?
Right. I mean, I avoid the term sovereignty for particular reasons that you can understand, and I avoid the term autonomy for the same sort of reasons. And so I am eager not to pin my heart to that, or pin those to my lapel. But I think it is. I would hold on to the baseline political equality, at least of vote and the chance to give information, right, when it is relevant to the relevant solution space, to the relevant, to the problem we're trying to decide something about. Because it seems to me very difficult to create conditions without a very benevolent ruling group who says, well, you don't have the vote, Zena, right? And you'll only speak when you're called on. But because we're really, really, really benevolent, we will always call on you when it is relevant, and we will never, ignore the interests that you may have some sense of that we just are sort of overlooking. So I think that it seems to me difficult to imagine a way in which only some people have decision authority is not a tyranny of some sort. And in my world, the people of my Demopolis world, people reject tyranny of any sort, no matter how benevolent, right? They're basically saying that no matter how benevolent, it's still tyranny. It's still some people ruling, and we don't accept that. So I think that once again, the snuck in at the very beginning this diversity condition, that we actually have very different interests, very different viewpoints. So if we were all pretty sure that we had the same values, and you were sure that whoever is running things really shared your values all the way down, then the only time you'd really need to say something is when you noticed something that nobody else noticed, but you really wouldn't worry about it much. But in a very genuinely diverse society, you can't assume that. There are going to be contested votes. Not everything is going to be common interest.
Carl. So I may have a slightly different thought process as I'm listening to you. It's the question of societies frequently thinking that we're a great society now, therefore we will always be a great society.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And if I look back at Athens, obviously a very influential society at its time with its model, and you fast forward several hundred years, I'm going to say, into the Roman society.
Mm-hmm.
Pane at Circenses comes to mind, so bread and entertainment essentially,
mm-hmm,
right, to keep the masses happy. Right, but you then forward a couple of thousand years, and all of a sudden Rome isn't what it used to be, and now we find ourselves in another society that is one of the most powerful societies. And there's sort of the question that I'm bringing forward with that observation is, at certain times there's an uncertainty in the society, and then sometimes people look for a strong leader. And the question I bring out of that is democracy inherently a better model than another model, right? Under certain circumstances, the people will select that they may take something back. They want to be the cat in the cage there, because it seems to be a better situation for where I find myself. Now, I don't agree with that model, but I'm just saying populations in general sometimes go into these extremes.
No, they certainly do. There's various ways to answer this. The first is that this really is meant as what Bernard Williams would call sort of a local solution, a here and around, now and around here solution for some people who have, for reasons that I don't need to specify, certain preferences, and in this case you've got this non-tyranny preference. So if you think coming in that the best way to live is to have, a wise and benevolent or maybe divinely ordained leader, I have sort of nothing to say to those people. But I think your question is a little different from that. It's that we can start out saying we prefer non-tyranny, but then things change, and we may have other reasons to finally say, now we need to have move along that. So I think there's nothing that can guarantee that a democratic society that will be permanently stable, right? That's too much to hope for. There's no form of government. Monarchy isn't permanently stable. Aristocracy isn't. Nothing is. On the other hand, I think we have ways to think about why you would get transitions away from democracy if you attend to these sort of costs and benefits. So if you say that we're in this because we want non-tyranny, but we also want prosperity and security, if we're in a world in which our way of doing things democratically is really compromising our security or our prosperity. At a certain point, you can say the costs are too high. Not everyone's that person at the very end of the, tale of, hates autocracy, not going to give up everything just to keep away the tyrant. And so you'll get a tyrant. So you have to ask yourself, under what conditions will democracy be unable to answer the needs of security and prosperity, and that gets you to the what are the conditions that allows a democracy to do well? And this is what Zena was briefly alluding to, because she knows some of my other work on this. Is this idea that you aggregate diverse knowledge in a democracy because you have freedom of speech, because you have equality of vote. It's possible, and you have the right incentives because you share some values, you see some things are matters of common interest, like basic security, that in fact you are willing to share with others knowledge that is of value to the decisions we have to make together. And if you do that right, if you get the institutions that do it right, you actually can get, I think, pretty extraordinary results. I think that's why ultimately Athens does as well as Athens does in a very competitive environment, because they actually figure out how to aggregate a lot of information and do it pretty efficiently over time. So that's the, but once again, if we don't do that, if our institutions no longer work to aggregate diverse knowledge, if we just get into echo chambers and ultimately, we're not sharing what we know, we're going to lose that advantage. Democracy isn't going to deliver this kind of knowledge aggregating feature, and then the costs are going to arguably get higher than they're worth. So, this is political theory. It's not a bunch of policy prescriptions. It may point to policy prescriptions. Let's spend more money educating our youth in basic, civic education. But it's it's really a way to sort of think about what is it that would potentially allow a democracy to be robust, to change over time. What are the things that creates the kind of ossified, sclerotic tendency of a democracy not to be able to respond, and therefore gives people, I think, wrong, but that's from my personal value position, the wrong decision that living in a cage is okay.
We have some questions over here. A gentleman in the red shirt, and then the person next to him, and then Melissa.
Okay, so how does a society that's democratic legitimize itself in a world where there are a lot of other societies that are much larger and much stronger that don't see a democracy as something that's proper or should happen?
Yeah. So the democratic society is going to have to, and once again, I sort of snuck this in when I was setting it up, I'm imagining Demopolis as existing in an environment or an ecology of other states, some of which are hostile and some of which are authoritarian. So if Demopolis is just a tiny little one, all alone, it's the only one, gosh, it would be nice to be democratic. You've got really big, powerful autocracies right next door, and they decide, we're going to eat you up. You may well be just eaten right up. On the other hand, if there are multiple of these democratic societies, if these things have popped up in various times, and even if they're relatively small, you may find ways to say, we could actually pool some resources. We could develop federalism. Right? We could have ways in which there would be shared kinds of extensive citizenship, even though we keep local citizenship. We'll create a federal system that would allow us to do this. This is what happens, of course, in the American founding. So the American Constitution is exactly that problem. Great, big, powerful England, little dinky states, each one of them can be eaten right up. But if we get together, act together as a United States, we can, in fact, hold off the tyrant. So those are at least beginnings of thoughts. The other thing is that if we go to Greek history, we see that actually democracy turns out to be a kind of virus that spreads through the ecology. Other people say, actually, look, the guys over there are, getting to run themselves. They don't have these sort of mean bosses who, put them in cages or whatever. And they're just like me, right? Why can't I be a citizen? So we see the tendency of, within the Greek world anyway, of this way of organizing to actually spread and to become a threat to the autocratic states. So yeah, there are ways in which you can model it in which it's not going to work. The big autocracy is going to win, but I think there's other ways that you can imagine modeling it in which you'll have a way in which the big autocratic states are actually sufficiently worried about those democracies that they're going to have to do things like saying, oh, we're one too. We're a democracy too. And of course, that's the world we're in now, right? Lots of autocrats out there saying, oh, we're Democrats too. Really? No, we have citizenship. So, democracy in a sense is one because all the autocrats have to claim to be a democracy. Is just at the same time as you might say democracy is at risk of losing because we may be forgetting how actually to be citizens and how to have a self-governing state. So we're in a very, very interesting moment in human history.
You have a question?
Do you believe that the United States now is still that democracy that the founders once incorporated trade center?
Right. Now that's a deeply complicated question. I don't think we're not the same regime that was established at the end of the 18th century. Of course, the founders didn't initially want to call what they were doing a democracy. Whether it was one or not is another question. So if you go to the Federalist Papers and you ask Madison, he says, absolutely not. Democracy is not what we're doing republic. If you go to the preamble of the Constitution and you think about the three great big words at the beginning of the think about the written version of the handwritten version of the Constitution, and it says in great big letters, "We the people do ordain," and so on. So it basically is, the Constitution is not, at least what the Constitution says, the product of, Madison and a few guys in Philadelphia. It is the product of we the people who ratified it. And so in that case you say, wow, this is really a democratic document. Given that, the imagination of citizenship in the late 18th century was sort of similar, in fact, perhaps even more restrictive to that than that of Athens. So I think you can find moments in which which America looks quite a lot like a basic democracy once you keep in the imagination of citizenship restraint. So Jacksonian America looks, to be pretty much like a basic democracy, imperfect in lots of ways, and of course not liberal. Slave society, women don't have rights, and so on, but has many of the features of a basic democracy. As you see, I'm skirting your question because you said now, and so I think that this one. Let us say that I'm very, very concerned about American democracy now. I think that it is, we're painfully close, I think, to people basically saying, I really don't need to be a citizen, that what a citizen is simply maybe an expression just of patriotism, or maybe it's an expression of loyalty to a leader. I worry that we are, I don't know how close to, but being in a position in which the answer to that question would be certainly not. But I don't want to assert that we're in that condition yet, because in a sense, if I assert that, the only solution is some kind of a massive and revolutionary change. And that's a big cost, you know. Massive revolutionary change is a big cost. So I'd rather say we're hovering at a point in which, you know, you guys who are most of you are a lot younger than I am, should be thinking seriously about, you know, living, do you want to live as citizens in a reasonably free, reasonable, prosperous society without somebody who is your boss? And if you do, what are the costs you're willing to pay?
Thank you.
Melissa?
This is a more detail-oriented question,
Sure.
so hopefully it's not too anticlimactic. But there was a line in your model in the thought experiment that interested me, where citizenship seemed to be a little more flexible than we're used to thinking of it as being, and that if people, citizenship could be revoked if people didn't fully participate, fully pay the costs.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you thought that was and then also all the people who like autocracy leave, which is convenient in a way. So I was wondering if you thought that was necessary to the model, given that I know it's not policy prescriptions, but in our contemporary society, citizenship is pretty inalienable, if for no other reason than that then you become stateless and other states don't want you. So given that, do you think that flexibility is necessary?
Yeah. This is, I mean, and this is where, you know, you may say that, you know, democracy and liberalism just do butt heads, because if my model's set up right, the participation is in fact necessary. It doesn't mean you have to participate all the time, but it does mean, for example, if you get the equivalent of a juror summons, or if we imagine in Demopolis, there's not only a juror summons, there's you're going to be on the Civic Council to help think about, I don't know what, reorganizing traffic rules, or resetting the marginal tax rate, or making some recommendations to your fellow citizens like that. And we need citizens to do that. So the basic idea is, if you say, look, I'm too busy, you know, got all of these other things to do, I'm just not going to do that. Or I'm going to do an end run that makes, you know, endlessly defer it. Then at some point, we're going to say, well, look, actually, you know, everyone else is paying costs and Melissa isn't. And you say that at some point, you know, if you're just not willing to do it, we need to change the deal. We have to change the nature of your involvement in the society. And so what I imagine is that you would have a potential of being a permanent resident, you know, like whatever, a green card holder or something, who would not be a citizen, would not be expected to participate in the work of self-governance. You would enjoy security. You would enjoy the prosperity that is, you know, available to you. You wouldn't simply be expelled from the, because we're not assuming you're in other ways criminal, right? But there would be burdens put upon you because you're not a citizen. We're paying costs, so there's going to have to be some equivalent costs you pay. So it might be you pay at a different tax rate, right? You're going to permanently pay some special taxes that we figure, well, that's more or less making up from the work that the rest of us, or at least are subject to doing, that you just don't want to do. So I think that you could have a way of basically choosing to not do that stuff and not thereby become a nobody, an exile, but rather but somebody who would, in fact, be subject to other burdens, and you would, at least until you regain your citizenship, because there's no reason you can't say, all right, I want to regain my citizenship. I will agree to do my citizen duties. But until then, you're not going to have any say in what the disabilities you suffer under are. So the marginal tax, we might say, look, it's war, and we're going to double the marginal tax rate on those who aren't citizens. You don't have any say in that. So there are costs to you, not only in whatever the current things are, but you don't have any control over about what the conditions of, in a sense, your membership are going to be. So that's hard, right? And I also, this whole thing is also hard in that, and this has come up in, I've talked about this in a couple of other places. I think it's perfectly plausible to say that instead of just immigrants who take some kind of citizenship test and then have to give an oath of allegiance to the rules, the Constitution, which you have to do. If you're an immigrant and you want to be a citizen of the United States, you have to take a test and you have to say an oath. Why should that be only immigrants? Why should the happenstance of being born in this country free you of that responsibility? And I don't see any principled reason that it should. And that the test can't be, and this is where we go back to civic test, the test can't be so burdensome. We have to really think about that. It's not a literacy test. It's not it's not all of the things that exclude various categories of people. It has to be rightly done, but it has to be basically, ultimately, a way in which you give a affirmative assent. You say, yes, I will. I will be a citizen, and rather than sort of passively, well, whatever, I guess I am. And that's, once again, liberals tend to balk at this kind of thing, but I don't see why. It seems to me actually fairer to ask everybody to do the same thing, and that birthright citizenship seems to be sort of an odd conception. It ought to be choice of being a citizen, ought to be essential to being a citizen.
Michael? So, I'm just going to reflect my own penchant of thinking. But in the interest of democratic discourse, I'll put to you an alternative theory of democracy. I just want your response to it.
Sure.
So let's go back to your late Paleolithic hunter-gatherer band. You talked about the importance of having people communicate with one another and monitor one another in the interest of survival.
Right.
To use a bit of jargon, you could say that it was important for them to do that because they were buffering against the risk of failure, right? But then you asserted that with the emergence of agricultural societies, you have an autocrat who steps in. And that's an efficient way of organizing society of a certain scale. But it seems to be it's efficient towards the ends of whoever that person or the elite is, which automatically, to my mind, involves an issue of legitimacy. In other words, you have to be able to persuade people that they should give up their local and collective risk buffering in the interest of that person, on grounds presumably that that person or that elite group controls knowledge or material resources that are critical to survival of everybody. Now, you may be able to do that, but it also means locating those resources in a small space with respect to the rest of society means that that's a place that's very susceptible to crises, hence the critical resources. And we know historically that you have this concentration of resources and they meet crises and they fall apart really rapidly. So is democracy perhaps then a reaction to the sorts of crises that emerge that happen in autocracies as a way of buffering against risk, rather than it being a question of a personal tendency towards anti-tyranny versus tyranny, or anti-autocracy versus autocracy. And the last comment I'll make is, it seems to me then that if you're going to transmit a value, the civic education of democracy, you might transmit it as, this is not about personal whims, about psychology more than it is, this is a way of making sure that society is in fact sustainable in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's all plausible. I mean, the societies that emerge with agriculture typically gain their legitimacy by what I would say are lies, noble or otherwise. Why should you obey the pharaoh or the great king or so on? Because they have a special relationship to some sort of divine order. And then why, in terms of sort of your rational, what if you say, but I don't really buy that, then you obey because you'll be punished if you don't. I think it is the case, and you just have to look now at sort of, it depends on what sort of organizational theory that you like best. There are certainly organizations that work efficiently with command and control from the top down. But as you say, very hierarchical command and control organizations tend to, in fact, be quite vulnerable to systemic change because they're not very robust. They're not able to quickly pivot to some different way of doing things, and I think that the organization of knowledge in a democratic society is in fact one of the strengths of a democratic society. You can actually make big changes pretty quickly. And so I think that if you think about the Demopolis folks here, over here, the initial ones, I'm perfectly happy that might be the reason that a lot of these people are in. I like it initially to be diverse reasons rather than shared values, because if they all say, well, I believe in freedom as a value, and I believe in equality as a value, and I basically believe in basic human rights as a value, well, then we have a society of liberals that are trying to set up a liberal society because they share values. But I think it's perfectly plausible that they would say, no, actually, I don't trust those autocrats to run the society in the face of the challenges that I bet are coming down the pike in the reasonable future. So I think all of that is, as it were, a strengthening move that gives reasons to say, that maybe that instead of a normal distribution, the standard bell-shaped curve, maybe if you really had a sensible society, it would look, the curve, the bulge would be way over here, because people would say, there's lots more reasons that Michael suggests.
The response was started with the appearance of the normal curve.
Yeah. Well, it's but yeah, I think the more people understand about the potential of democracy as an actual effective organizing system, the less autocracy seems like a good thing, because I think that's one of the arguments of autocracy is it won't work any other way. You're in real trouble if there aren't people at the top who are organizing things. That's the only, so that's Hobbes, right? The only solution is some sort of a sovereign. Yeah. No, and I think Abby had a
question, and then there's time for one more after that.
I guess in light of our elections right now, thinking about that, related to Dr. Bailey's question, what would you say to somebody who said that they did not want to vote because they didn't like either candidate?
Yeah.
This is a very popular thing people are saying nowadays. What do you say to that?
Yeah. I think that what I would say, and this is, I hope I can do it sort of from this world rather than just my personal perspective, is that to be a citizen is to act as an adult and to be treated as an adult by your fellow citizens. So that infantilization is one of the basic ways to attack dignity. But I think that if you act as an adult, it means that you have to recognize that many times very important decisions are not between the best and the less good, or the very bad, or even between the pretty good and the pretty lousy. Sometimes your decisions are between what you regard as the pretty lousy and the really bad. And as an adult, you can say, look, I am willing to take the chance, the risk of going into that really bad situation because I want to register a protest. But you have to think of what kind of protest that is. You want to really make that a real protest. And a protest that says that if we're in the really bad, and where the really bad is pretty awful, people are getting really hurt by it, you're still going to say, but I registered my protest, and I'm willing to have people suffer that way in order to, feel good about my conscience or to, awaken you to the importance of the protest. But I think those are pretty high stakes, right? And I think you have to ask yourself, when does a choice not to participate or to register a protest vote of some sort, when is it actually not doing your civic duty? When is it just simply, I feel better about myself, right? And I like to feel good about myself. That's not the work of a citizen, right? The work of a citizen is, what do we need? And this is the public, lots of things you should do to feel better about yourself, that big black box. But you shouldn't be doing everything about it.
Anthony, you have a question?
Why is it throughout history, autocracy and democracy seem to be a cycle of shifting back and forth?
Yeah, and I think this is the one of the ways to think about it, is that democracy is really hard to get to work at scale. And I think autocracy is relatively easier to make work at scale, at least for a while, right? So that the basic, autocratic plan is you get one person at the top, gives orders to 10 people, gives orders to 100 people. It's infinitely scalable, right? If everybody takes their orders and delivers their orders, and even with principal agent problems and so on, it can work pretty well, especially if everybody says, well, the guy at the top after all is sort of divine and you wouldn't want to cross him because the world might end. And so it works. It generally works. It's really hard to get a democracy to work at scale. You have to solve these problems of collective action. You have to develop institutions that really do allow people to share knowledge. So you have to create sort of these bright line rules that people really do, know together. You have to create kind of civic education so people really do believe that their fellow citizens are not a bunch of morons, to use appropriate language. And I think that we could see that, the foragers had it figured out, sort of naturally. The Athenians then sort of get this breakthrough thing. Hey, here's a bunch of strange ideas about institutions, but, we've got to take a shot here. I mean, it's really a crisis moment for them. And it turns out that they get it right enough so that it really works well. And then it sort of spreads through the Greek ecology, and everyone says, wow, in a society up to a few 100,000 people, this really, we can do it. It actually allows us to get up to the size of the Roman Empire, and we don't know how to do it anymore. Direct democracy isn't going to work. We need a whole set of new institutions. And in the meantime, the autocrats are saying, we've got this hierarchy thing, and it works just fine. So I think that that's really the thing, that every time you scale, you really create new challenges that need to be addressed by both social technologies and, in some cases, by actual communications technologies. We have to be able to, if communication is a part of that basic human package, we have to find ways that we can communicate, across vastly larger numbers and greater distances. We've got that kind of technology around, but we don't know how to build it into the right kind of institutional framework so it really gets the job done. So I think that's it. Autocracy is always there as the default of command and control, works just fine at any scale you want. Every time we try to build up the next scale, we have to reinvent democracy, at least the institutional structures of democracy. But the whole argument here is it's predicated on the same baseline assumption that a collective self-governance requires these commitments to citizens, to one another, to do things as citizens.
I think I'm going to call an end to the question session. We have a reception that we need to get to, but I'd like everybody to join me in thanking Professor Ober for a fantastic.
Thank you all. Thank you all. This is really extremely helpful.